Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler episode. Today I'm taking a look at my portable gaming systems, and right off the bat I know exactly which one you want me to talk about, so we're gonna do that one last. Anyways, let's get started with this, because I don't really have too many, so not really too much to talk about. First up is my Nintendo Game Boy. Now, I actually got this thing about 5 days before I got my NES, and I was really playing DOS games and PC games and stuff before this thing. But in any case, I have about a couple dozen games for my Game Boy, and this is actually only the first Game Boy I've got, because I actually got a second one too. But I didn't get the second one until much later in life, way past when the Game Boy was, well, the thing. I think it was up to the Game Boy Color at that point. I also have a Game Boy Pocket, and this one I particularly bought because the original Game Boy, it has this issue where the lines sort of disappear vertically. So I picked up the Game Boy Pocket particularly because I wanted to play Pokemon when it was new, and I couldn't really see the stats on my original Game Boy because a whole bunch of vertical lines are missing. One thing I like about the Game Boy Pocket is that it only uses 2 AAA batteries, and it has a really small form factor with the same size screen as the original Game Boy. The only catch is that for some bizarre reason, this thing still works, but it's got these strange corrosion spikes growing off of the nails. Now, I can't show you on the camera because they're absolutely tiny, but it's just weird like that. Next up is my Sega Game Gear. Now, I've had this thing almost for the lifespan of the Game Gear, and it never really worked perfectly. Like, when I first got this thing, the headphone jack barely worked properly. It only output one side most of the time. And the speaker itself has been getting quieter and quieter ever since I first bought this thing. The screen, it's got all these little green spots everywhere because the pixels are dying. It works, it's just, and the games that I've got for it are good enough. It's just, I really need to get this thing overhauled before I can really use it again. In any case, I've got about a dozen games for it. Next we have my Game Boy Advance SP. And yeah, I never had a Game Boy Color, and I never had an original Game Boy Advance. The reason why I don't have those systems is because the Game Boy Color, there was never really that many games specifically for Game Boy Colors that I wanted. Like, I mean, some of the games for the Game Boy Color came on these special black cartridges to indicate that they would work perfectly fine on an original Game Boy. And I think I only have 2 Game Boy Color only games that will only work in a Game Boy Color. And for those ones, I just play it on my Game Boy Advance SP. It's fully backwards compatible. And the reason why I don't have a Game Boy Advance because, well, nobody could see the screen on it. In any case, I got about 16 games for this thing, and not really too much to say about it. The battery's kind of not holding a charge perfectly anymore. Like, it still does, it just doesn't hold it for nearly as long as it used to. Next, we have my Nintendo DS Lite. Now, I never had an original Nintendo DS. I kind of a little late on some of these sometimes. But I still have about 10 games for this thing, and I do want to pick up a Nintendo 3DS at some point. I don't really have too much to say about this thing, except for the fact that I do still use it. I do have some really good games for it, and I also still use it for backwards compatibility, because it's so much easier to see the screen on this thing than on the original Game Boy Advance. The only thing I find weird is that so many of the games play at 30 frames a second, even though the thing is capable of 60 frames a second. So if you want to know a game that does play at 60 frames a second on the Nintendo DS, try Populous DS. I'm serious, the Populous game on the Nintendo DS is probably one of the only ones I know of that runs 60 frames a second. Pretty much everything else is 30 or less. But now we come to the system you're probably all curious about here. This here is my Wonderswan Swan Crystal. Now, okay, the Wonderswan was a game system released in Japan, only in Japan, that was the direct competitor for the Nintendo Game Boy. Well, not too early in its life. The Wonderswan came quite a bit afterwards. But the interesting thing about it was it had a widescreen as opposed to the standard aspect screen. It was only grayscale at first, but then they eventually came out with the Wonderswan Color, and this particular model is the Wonderswan Swan Crystal, which is basically just an updated version of the Wonderswan Color to give it a more ergonomic form factor, I guess. The one interesting thing about it is that because of the widescreen, it's actually designed in such a way that you can play it horizontally, or you can play it vertically, and it's got buttons in those positions for that particular reason. But the one thing I really like about this thing, most of these old portables that take batteries, I mean, you got the original Nintendo Game Boy, takes 4 AA's, you got the original Sega Game Gear, takes 6 AA's, and that thing only lasts like 6 hours on them. This particular game system right here takes a single AA battery, just one, and lasts 15 hours on it. The battery life on this thing is crazy high, considering it's just using standard AA batteries. And before I actually show you some gameplay on this thing, let me just show you what the cartridges are like. Here's a Wonderswan cartridge, and yeah, it's as wide as the system really. You just pull it out of its little thing. It comes with a little plastic case. It's because the contacts are kind of exposed on it. The cartridges are designed so that they lie flush with the system so that you can't accidentally hit them or anything while you're playing the game. And yeah, so let's look at some gameplay. And please excuse the shakiness because I've never actually done anything like this before, playing a game through my viewfinder on the camera. Yeah, that's pretty much all I gotta say about my portables. Nothing too fancy. Don't have too many games for them. And don't have too big a selection of portables either, but hey, they all work, and I've got lots of great games for them, and that's what matters. So stay tuned for the next filler. I will be taking a look at my computer systems.